Hey everyone, welcome back. This is going to be part 2 of my stays videos. This is where we left off. All of the pieces were boned and the sides were finished. So here I am showing how the edges were finished off, just with a zigzag stitch, and then the next step is going to be sewing the pieces together. When pinning these together, I was being very careful to line up all the edges very straight. I did this because I thought it would show through to the front of the finished product, but I forgot that I was going to be sewing over tape on the seams for reinforcement anyway, so I probably didn't need to be that careful. I was really nervous to sew these together because I haven't pushed the limits of my machine that far, and this is 6 layers of fabric. And 4 of them are pretty heavy linen. I was very nervous, but it worked out okay. I pinned the seams flat here because I was worried about ironing, but in hindsight I think I could have totally just ironed them, or maybe just put a towel over it and then ironed and it would have been fine. Just a little bit of extra work I probably didn't need to do. Now begins my really inconsistent filming setups because I was visiting home for the next week. Here I am on an airplane looking like a weirdo sewing. No one actually said anything, but I felt really weird. On my plane journey, I was able to finish whipping down all of the seams that were going to be on the inside of the stays. This was just to make me feel better, I guess. It was probably an unnecessary step, but it makes it look nice and tidy. Next step is to add in this tape to go on each of the seams, mostly for cosmetic reasons, but I think it does add some extra strength to those seams that are going to come under stress when you lace these up. This camera angle is really funny. It's basically a stool with some cardboard boxes on it, and my phone is being held between 2 boxes of golf balls. It was a lot, but I was at my boyfriend's house and I was just trying to use what he had in order to film a little bit of me sewing. I found this really hard to sew because it's so rigid underneath with all the boning. You can't really manipulate it with your fingers to make it easier to pierce the fabric where you want. So I really had a hard time. But in the end, I think it looks okay. The thread matched the tape pretty good, so you can't really see how messy it is. And from far away, I think it looks really nice. This was my first attempt at binding. I thought I was going to be able to do it all by hand, which was a bit ambitious of me, I guess. And I hated the way it turned out, but I thought I'd add it in here just to show. I think I was doing a back stitch because I wanted it to be really strong. And it took me a long time, and then when I finished the chunk and I flipped over the bias tape, I hated how uneven it looked on the bottom, which is why I went to a machine next. I think this didn't turn out how I wanted because I'm an amateur sewer, so my tension was probably off, and this is really, really narrow bias tape, so any sort of mistake really shows through to the front. And I wasn't matching up with the stitch lines on the stays from where I closed off the boning channels, and it really bothered me. So I ripped it all out and tried again the next day when I was feeling better. I took a little break from binding to regain my sanity, and I worked on the straps. Thinking back, I don't know if you actually need to sew these together and flip them inside out, because you end up binding them anyway, which covers the raw edge. And I could probably read the pattern instructions, which I definitely did not, but to me it seemed like you should sew the 3 layers together and then flip them out, iron it, and then you have finished edges already, but then you just bind it for continuity with the rest of the stays. This lovely camera angle is being provided by my phone in a windowsill being held up by playing cards. In my very limited experience sewing, I've always hated turning things out, and my god, this was such a pain and I hate it. And there's probably tricks to doing it, but I just brunted through it, and I guess I tried to use a pen to shove it through, did not work, and just had to do it the slow way. Would not recommend trying to iron and videotape at the same time. It does not work. Time to get those straps on before I forgot and started binding without them, which I almost did. My second technique for the binding was to use my finger to sort of press open half of the bias tape that I purchased, and then to pin that exactly where I wanted it in sort of inch increments to hold it super in place, and then adjust while sewing to make sure I am sewing right in that ditch of the first fold. This was a really slow and tedious process. You don't want to go too fast and sew over a pin or accidentally sew off the line you're trying to stitch. And I was also checking every so often to make sure that when you flip over the binding around, it looks nice on the front and isn't going against some other stitches that are already on the stays. Next up was the dreaded tabs. I really didn't know what to do, so this was just trial and error, basically bunching it up as orderly as possible, I guess. So the problem I realized partway through doing this binding is that because my stays are fully boned, some of the bones sit right on the edge of the fabric. Therefore, there is no little 1/8 of an inch bit of fabric without a bone in it that I can sew through to put this binding on. So every so often when I would hit a place like that, I would have to stop my machine sewing and then start hand sewing until it got back to a point where there was a place to sew the binding on with the machine without a bone, which made this slow process go even slower. I never know how much actual sewing footage to leave in these videos without making them too long, but this was definitely the hardest part of the whole project, so I thought I would at least leave some of my struggle in here. Also, don't want to leave out this wonderful camera angle as being provided by my phone being tied to a bolt of fabric that is leaning against the ironing board. Who would have thought? To avoid frustrations, I thought it was a good idea to fully check my progress before, going off and binding the whole stays and then looking at them later and realize, oh my God, I was doing a corner all wrong and having to go back and rip it all out, which was lucky because one of my corners was totally messed up and I don't know how it happened, but it made me avoid it later. If you can see, I sewed over. It looks fine from the sewing machine side, but I accidentally sewed through too much of one of the corners. So I had to rip that out and redo it. Here's one of those sections that I have to do by hand. You're going right on top of a bone, so you're just sewing that top 2 layers of fabric. So it's not going all the way through. So the bone can actually just pop out to the side at this point before you wrap the binding around to the other side. This is the last footage I have of the binding process. Here I am nowhere near done. I've just barely started, but I've kind of showed what all the different parts look like, and you just continue that all the way around. And the hard part is this first side that I did by machine, mostly by machine, and then a little bit by hand. The second part, you just turn everything to the other side and you just whip stitch it down. I was a little confused, so these are going to be fully lined stays, but I don't want the eyelets going through that lining because it's supposed to be removable. But the way I did the edges where the lacing is going to be, I just folded them over so the raw edges are sitting on the inside, and then I just whipped it down earlier. But I didn't want to do the eyelets over that because, there's a chance that fabric could start fraying. So my solution to that was to cut these little strips of the lining fabric that will be permanently in the stays. It's like one long strip that I just folded over all the edges in, and then I just whipped that down over where the seams are, or the raw edges are. And then I was able to put the eyelets through that, and that will never go away. So here they all are pinned down. I think I was just being super extra cautious. A lot of people on Instagram said I could just ignore the raw edges, but it didn't take me too long to just whip these in there before starting the eyelet process. And I was probably trying to postpone because that was so hard to do the eyelets. I'm going for spiral lacing for these, just like my mock-ups. That's what would have been historically accurate. I'm using that air-soluble pen again to draw right down the middle of the lacing strip, or the lacing channel, I guess, to make sure that I don't... So basically to make sure that they all line up in the end. And then after I have those drawn on, the next step is to then draw where I'm going to make the eyelets. For drawing these in, you pick a spot on the top where you want it to start, and both sides are going to line up at that exact point. And you choose one side to make a mark, and then a 1/2 inch down you make the next eyelet, and then continue all the way down to when you want to stop the lacing in 1-inch increments. Then on the other side, you don't start with that 1/2 inch, and you just start exactly the same spot, go in 1-inch increments all the way down until the bottom, and you will need a 1/2 inch between eyelets to match up at the end. Now for the eyelets, the first step, I was just using silk thread that I then got 3 loops through my needle so that I was sewing with 6 threads at once. My process was to again use my lovely meat thermometer as my, oh gosh, what are those called? An awl, I think? It felt silly to buy one, and a meat thermometer is exactly the same. To begin with a new thread, I start away from the eyelet hole and bring my thread right above it. I then hold that thread down tightly and make my first stitch for the eyelet. Oh, it looks like I pulled it out, which does happen a lot, especially since I had that stupid band-aid on my finger. But again, you just start the stitch, hold on to it without making any knot, and make your first stitch. After you have about 2 of these stitches in, that's all it takes to really hold that tight, and you don't really have to focus on holding the thread anymore. I wasn't being anywhere super accurate with these. I wasn't counting like how many stitches for each eyelet, just eyeballing it. And basically you just continue around, making sure to protect, basically what you're trying to do is protect the inside of that hole you're making. So just cover it up. I know some people only do like 8 stitches with a lot of thread. Some people make it so it looks like a complete circle. Mine kind of look like daisies or something, which is kind of cute, but it's all the work I was willing to do for these, and I think they looked okay. And then before ending this one, I like to open the eyelet back up because it sort of closes while you're stitching it, and make sure it looks like the other ones. And then to finish it off, I then threaded it through the last stitches that I had just made, probably like 3 or 4 of them, and I think that helps to secure. Then you start your next eyelet. I'm using just the end of pointy scissors to help me because the meat thermometer is not that sharp. And then do the same thing. You just stitch through the fabric, bring it up right by the eyelet, and start with your first stitch. And now you don't have to worry about holding the thread tight because it's already coming from the last eyelet. I ended up doing 40 eyelets in total, 4 for the straps and 36 for the lacing. I did it all in one night. I'm a crazy lunatic, and I had bruises on my hands the next day because I was not using a thimble or any sort of protection on my hands, but I was so happy to be done. For the spiral lacing, I'm going to kind of do a demo here, but I don't know about you guys, but it's super hard for me to visualize what I'm doing without a diagram. So I basically Googled spiral lacing, and there's some lovely diagrams that help show where the lacing should only be visible from the front. Basically, you're making a spiral, right, through the loops. So you just go up through one, down through the next, up through one, down through the next, all the way around till you get to the bottom. And all of the fronts should be slanted in the same direction, going from the back side to the front. It's kind of confusing, which is why I always needed to look at the diagram. I had to keep looking back at it all the time to make sure I was doing it right. here are the finished stays. I think I have them on okay. I have all the extra ribbon like tucked up from the bottom, but I feel like most people tuck it in from the top. So next time I'll tighten up instead of down. The armpits aren't too high, which I was worried about when I added the extra inch. Everything seems to fit okay. I don't know how about sitting down, doesn't feel very comfortable, but I'm not sure it's supposed to. Here's the back. I have them laced open farther so that I could tighten the front more. I had hoped to get them all the way closed, and I think I could, but they wouldn't be very comfortable. So, yeah. The tabs, I think they do hit a little. I think my natural waist is like right here, so I think they are. I should not have added the extra inch, because I think it should be more like up here. But now these are like too high in my armpits, so yeah. You win some, you lose some. I think they fit basically okay. And that's it for the stays. Thanks for watching. I know I sort of fumbled my way through this, but in the end, they are functional, and that is all that mattered. And I think they are beautiful.